organizer of this event, which, if you're confused, is essentially a celebration of the completion of a long, hashed process of developing a white paper for the company Daios, which is an AI ethics tech startup. So, woo!
Nice.
Would you like to introduce yourselves?
Okay, I'm Megan. I'm the CEO and co-founder.
I'm Andrew. I'm a head of product and a tech guy.
I'm Tom, and I'm the AI ethics lead.
Okay, cool. So we're just gonna do a quick chat about the company and some of our thoughts, and not too much about the paper, just because the paper itself explains what it is. But then we'll open it up to a Q&A if people have questions, or if you want to have a debate or be a little spicy. We're happy to field some opinions. But yeah, so basically, tell us a little bit, Megan, Tom, Andrew, about what inspired you to start Daios in the first place.
Okay, I think I'm gonna take this one because I think the idea originated with me, and the reason why I even started to think about making a startup in this area was because for a long time I had worked in AI and machine learning, and I knew a bit obviously about philosophy, and I noticed that a lot of the solutions that were popping up for AI ethics were, you know, solving a lot of like superficial issues, but they didn't actually solve like what was actually happening at the deeper level. And I was waiting for someone else to do it, to actually come up with a solution, a better solution. And so yeah, after some time I realized that it wasn't heading in that direction. And that's why this particular paper, we take a stance that's like really different than what the current industry follows. You know, because I think that there's a better approach. So that's really what inspired Daios in the beginning. And I met Tom a while before Daios started. And yeah, one of our mutual contacts, he said, reach out to Tom, and I was like, okay. So I reached out to him, and yeah, he was very sympathetic to the ideas that I had, and yeah, so that's how it all started.
Cool.
Yep.
I didn't know that already. Okay, so cool. Tom, tell us a little bit about your background with AI and things that you hope to accomplish with Daios as a platform, as a company.
Yeah, so I had already been working in the kind of AI ethics space for several years before Daios and before Megan reached out to me. I designed a PhD in machine ethics while I was in grad school at Berkeley. So I did a PhD at UC Berkeley in the Bay Area of California. And I was actually originally studying social sciences there, so I was doing a sociology PhD. And while I was preparing for that, I was looking around me. Everybody's on their phones all the time. There were actually robots starting to go around the streets of Berkeley. There was a startup already doing that, and I was like, I think that really society is going to be downstream of whatever the hell these companies are doing now. I didn't know what that meant, but it was obvious. And I remember reaching out to professors to tell them, like, hey, I want to actually do a PhD topic on like AI and society. And they said, well, you can't do that, because that's not something that, where would you do that? What department would that be in? There's no existing discipline that can handle that. And I said, well, I think maybe give it a few years and that might change. And so it turns out I was lucky enough to be able to design my own PhD. So I just assembled a committee from scratch and was based working at a lab focused on AI safety, which if you guys have heard of people who are focused on existential risk or the kind of ethics of AI coming out of OpenAI, and Anthropic. I know a lot of those people because this was back in 2016 when they were up-and-comers like myself. So I was kind of collaborating with some of those people, interacting with them, but also disagreeing with them about what it meant to build AI to be good and to be safe. And so when Megan then reached out to me with her ideas for Daios, I was like, yeah, that resonates with a lot of my own much deeper bedrock philosophical skepticism of what these companies are doing right now. And I think this vision needs to be articulated as an alternative to what is kind of the accepted orthodoxy of like how you should build AI at scale.
Okay. Cool. So Andrew, I'll give you a thinker. Now I just have to think of it. Okay. What is your what do you think is the most intriguing about the AI ethics space right now?
For me, the most intriguing is that everyone is doing it wrong. Yeah, so basically, we are heading towards a dystopia. So, one scenario is that we have a bunch of big AI companies that are dominate all kinds of industry because everyone knows that everyone here is gonna lose their jobs because of AI, right? And we're gonna, as citizens or as people here, we're gonna lose our agency in favor of AI systems, machines, bots, whatever. Right? That's one scenario. I really don't want this. The other is that people will be scared of this scenario and they will lobby the various governments to do something about this. And governments, as they tend to do, will come up with very heavy-handed regulation. Will completely destroy our industry. I don't want that either, because AI is a wonderful technology that can unlock huge productivity gains. I don't want AI eventually to be destroyed. Part of it, right? So, okay. So what do we do about this? What we do about this is that we provide a way for users of AI systems, or consumers, or people at large, to be able to retain their agency when they interact with AI systems. We want a way to not be dictated ethical values by third parties, but to impose our own AI bots or systems that we work with. So I know you guys have read Dune or seen the movie, right?
Yeah.
In Dune lore, there's this concept called barbarian jihad, right? So the story goes that sometime in the future, humans are scared of machines and they go on a huge jihad, destroy all thinking machines. And from now on, any kind of AI in this Dune universe is forbidden, right? So this is the thing I want to avoid. Basically, I want a barbarian jihad without destroying thinking machines. I want thinking machines working for us.
Okay.
And everyone else is doing it wrong. And we hopefully provide a move in the right direction.
Okay. So without necessarily delving too much into the specifics of the paper, would you like to describe maybe a little bit about what the industry currently looks like and how that differs from your proposition and the way that the approach that daios is going to take?
Okay. I guess we've gone around, so I'll go again. Okay. So from the perspective of AI ethics, there's really two big things that are kind of almost taboo. Like, you can't really talk about it. People don't really focus on these ideas at all. Which is, first of all, we don't actually know how to control AI behavior. Okay, we don't know how, but everyone acts as if we do, and we don't. And that's a problem. And so people keep trying different things to manipulate models, or maybe change some kind of training data, do something like reinforcement learning, human feedback. Like, these things, they think, okay, integrate humans more, and we'll be able to control behavior. But that's not true. How do we know that the behavior is actually changed in the way that we want, and that the things that we changed actually did what we wanted to do? So the thing that we do at daios, what our theory is that we actually can train machines to behave in certain ways, because machines learn from data, right? And so that's really our thesis there. And I don't want to go too deep into it. You can read the paper if you want. But it's a very basic concept. It's really not too complicated. So, but a lot of people seem to miss that data itself is a source of AI behavior. So although we don't understand why AI makes decisions, we do know that there is a way to map input and output of AI behavior. So that's the first thing. So the second thing that's being missed right now in AI ethics is the fact that we seem to avoid talking about what does it mean to build values into AI. Like whose values? Like whose ethical values are we going to put in there? You can't just say, oh yeah, let's make it responsible, right? But responsible to whom? You know, we need to make that very explicit. And that's something that really, I think, daios, how it's different from most solutions, is we don't want to posit any particular ethical system and say, you must follow this now. If you don't, you can't use this AI, right? People should be able to express their own individuality when they use AI and when they use like their technology, right? You should be able to choose what kind of things you want on your feed, what, you know, how the algorithm behaves, like what content you don't want to see. And these are just basic concepts, right? Like seems so simple, but yet we don't really have any control over that, which is what we want to change with daios. So, yeah.
I think I'm going to open it up to questions, actually. I think I'm ready. If anybody has anything that they want to ask, or a particular field of AI that they're curious about how this applies, or
I have a question on just general AI, and this is something from not in your expertise at all. You know, just a wanderer that walked in at the bar.
You can wander into our Q&A. That's
Yeah.
sort of fun.
I don't want to do that much, but so, I mean, is AI at a point where that you may give values, you may give parameters for it to kind of hit a wall, right? Can it get beyond that? Is there a way where it will, you know, eventually kind of override what parameters and values that you set? Or is it some sort of firewall block where it just terminates on that point?
Yeah.
I can take it.
Sure.
So right now we have an example with ChatGPT. Yeah, there are firewalls, and there's a way to break out of the firewall. That's fine. Right now we estate that firewalls are usually broken. Maybe in the future people will come up with better firewalls. That's like a very technical issue. It's somewhat related to what we do, but not necessarily so. But yeah, you can.
I understand that you could break through, but from my, I guess, basic understanding when you guys are discussing is ethics and the moral set value of where you wanted to stop. Where you go, okay, you know what, there's.
Oh yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
It's just my basic understanding.
Yeah, I think that, so what Andrew is talking about is the current way of preventing AI from doing things is by giving it a list of actions that it can't do, right? But that's not really like not doing bad stuff, right? That's just don't pick up the spoon in this situation, right? Like, don't, say this type of word when you're talking about these kind of people, right? Like that's not enough. Right? It doesn't understand like virtue, right? It doesn't understand what good is, what bad is. And so that's also in an interesting way, like it's not a very good technical solution. It doesn't scale very well because like you have to just keep saying stuff that it shouldn't do. And basically daios, what we want to do is give it a sense of what values actually are. So instead of saying, oh, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, it'll like know, okay, this is the type of value that I want to do. Like this is like I want to be courageous, for example, and it's going to automatically choose that, and it won't be choosing hopefully unethical things, right? So that's really what we want to do.
I have a question as well. I guess more foundationally, like speaking of like the ambitions of daios, is the goal here to remain like a research and thought leadership based organization, or is there some product, whether that be like an API, an SDK, UI kits, or like general guidance for building visual things? Like what will daios provide to people who are building things in the space?
We were just discussing this earlier today, but in contrast to what some other companies are doing. But I think our vision as we were discussing it is that daios is going to really try and maintain kind of creative or productive tension between pure research on the one hand and applications on the other. And actually, the white paper kind of goes into this a little bit, and so the
Sorry.
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just, this is something that's actually very important for us, is that many, like when you think about the AI ethics, like what that means, you often either get kind of very highfalutin peer research questions that are very stylized and frankly very cartoonish, and that end up getting invested in with hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars, just because many powerful people just happen to be sympathetic to those ideas without really testing them or treating them as hypotheses that need to be like experimented upon. And then on the other hand, something more like just a PR initiative of like, oh, let's just marginally improve the branding of our product by building in ethics as this kind of ex post like module. And we really want to avoid both of those things, and part of the way you do that is by making it so, you know, I'm more kind of on the research side of things, but making it so that my ideas or the company's ideas of like what we actually want a good system to look like, how we define that, are actually continuously being applied, tested out, reinforced, and in a way that, you know, might put pressure on whatever I think is maybe the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. At the same time that I can also provide feedback on actually the way we design that interface is bad because that doesn't make sense for certain kinds of people, or it's actually going to end up generating behaviors that are not good, even if the actions are well controlled or something like this. So I think that tension is what, in a principled way, is what is missing right now.
Yeah, so a short answer is like, you want a product, not to impact the world.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just curious, like, I just want to give you something to do, you know what I mean?
I also just stumbled in here. I came in here to work and I'm fascinated by AI. And so I guess there are several aspects of ethics in AI. At least two of them that come to mind are the accuracy of the model. So implementing accuracy of models, and then how the models are used. So taking facial recognition is one example. I know in some cases some of the facial recognition models do a poorer job of identifying darker faces. So if you're using facial recognition, you're more likely to have false positives against dark-skinned people, and therefore it's unfair because of model inaccuracy. And then you look at the example of tiny and facial recognition, widespread surveillance of the population using facial recognition software. So facial recognition can be bad because the models are bad and therefore biased. But maybe it's okay to use the models as long as they're accurate. And then there's the use of the models. Where do you view your role in rural society in ensuring the models are accurate and then the models are appropriate?
I have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Tom, I know you have thoughts on those.
Yeah, so it is a great question. It's a very important question. A lot of the spirit of my work and also our conversations within daios are, there's a difference between building an accurate model and building a good system. So an accurate model, a model that is, you know, relatively unbiased or less biased. It's able to accurately map inputs onto outputs. If it sees your face, it's able to recognize that it's you. There's no discussion in that case of like, well, what is the use case? For what reason is the system being deployed? What is its purpose? Many actually people are arguing that facial recognition is an inherently toxic technology, that there is no safe application of it, regardless of how accurate it is, because it's not only racist in the ways that you would be indicating, or biased in ways that affect people differently, but it's also not obvious that we want to live in a society that can surveil itself and scale, right? So you can make that system perfectly accurate, but if you don't want to live in a world like that, you don't have to build it, right? That's a decision, and in fact, that's where the ethics comes in, is how are you defining the good in the context of this system? And if you can't, maybe don't build it. So part of what we're interested in, part of what the white paper explores as well, is how the domain application, the use case of the system, is part of what should factor into the definition of what the purpose of that system is. That the model is really just one component of, you know, including other things like the interface with the user, with the actual people that are being exposed to it, what interactions there can be between people in the system in question, the differences between just a discrete action taken by the model and the behavior that it manifests in people over time. We're changing much more in response to ChatGPT than the system itself is, I think. It's really our institutions, whether it's education, whether it's legal spheres, whether it's the medical field, those are much more likely to become brittle and shift arbitrarily in response to a model like that. And so that shift from fair models or accurate models to good systems is really at the kind of philosophical heart of this agenda.
I've already started touching on this, talking about like institutions kind of getting impacts back from these new technologies. But I guess what I'm curious about is like how are you considering like balancing values and then also unintended impacts? So I'm thinking about an idea of fairness and trying to consider fairness, but then having historical data that's collected or really limited data that's collected based off communities that we have available to like work with that might just have unintended impacts on communities that we've not been able to consider.
So I think like something that's a bit misunderstood about AI. I don't know if a lot of you have touched like ChatGPT or like played around with any models or actually built anything in AI maybe. But if you haven't, it's kind of hard to understand like how is it that AI actually works. And AI makes a lot of mistakes, like, and it will do that all the time. So that part of AI is really unavoidable. It's always about like how quickly can you respond to those mistakes and then fix them so that they don't happen in the future. But then you run into the same problem that we talked about, which is how many rules are you going to make that AI, that AI needs to follow, but doesn't actually like solve the problem, right? It's just a bunch of band-aids all the time, and that's what we're trying to avoid. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Kind of.
I mean, I guess I'm curious, like, and maybe this is something you're still figuring out. Like, are you interested in being in the more like regulation end of it? Are you interested in the more creation side of it, and trying to create something that isn't just putting out band-aids? Where do you stand in what you're trying to like work on?
Well, definitely what we want to do is be more active. So instead of being responsive to like, okay, now there's a new regulation, let's make sure that your model is like following all the laws and compliant. That's great that there's companies doing that, right? Somebody's got to do it. But we think that there's also a more active stance that you can take, and you can actually train models to be good. You don't have to wait for somebody to tell you that, your model made a mistake, right? You can actually like be proactive about it. And yeah, so I guess more on the active, creative, building side. Is that yeah? Okay.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't want to take the space.
No,
But,
go ahead. Yeah, it's fine.
I guess so who's good? Like whose definition of good is it? Is it depending on
Yeah.
who you're working with? Is it your definition of good? Like,
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's a very good question. Because that's something I mentioned in the beginning, right? It's whose values should we build into AI? And that's actually when I met Tom, I started to think a lot about this, and he presented a very specific vision, which is that AI, the values in AI should be determined by the people that are actually use that system, the people that are actually impacted by it.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and so that's why we want to focus on individuals using the system that you get to decide, right, when you use AI.
So
Yeah.
basically, not our definition of good. We don't want to be the priest of morality, right? That's not what we want to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, basically we want the the STEM guy has a question.
Yeah. This kind of
Yeah.
goes well with the whole regulation and rules, what's good
Yeah.
discussion. So I know in your paper you talk about kind of the projection of like using laws and regulation as your foundation for good. And it feels like laws, at least in democracy, are like an imperfect, like a heuristic for defining a common set of ethical principles. And I guess I'm wondering, like, how do you envision, like, why is that not a foundation of good to build on top of? And then, like, philosophically, do you want to incorporate laws and regulations at all into your models, or do you want to base it purely on ethical principles?
You can go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know you want to answer this
Or-
one. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding in many people's minds, according to us, is that following the law is the same as being ethical, and not following the law is the same as being unethical or immoral, right? For us, there is no identity between morality and what's legal or what's not legal. Right? These are separate things. So I want to answer the last question first. So yeah, we want to follow the law because we don't want to get in trouble. Okay? That's, yeah, of course. But the same question, we don't think that, we think that many things, particularly ethics related, belong in civil society. Like my vision of what's ethical behavior, I had my own ethical code. I don't want it imposed via law, right? I don't want to stay out of people's business, right? And I think that we're gonna have a healthy society where we don't try to impose our own visions of what's ethical and what's not on each other. This belongs in civil society. And we're gonna avoid a lot of civil strife when we act like that. That's why we want to anticipate people's panic when it comes to various AI development, so that we don't have changes in legal code that mandate a particular course of action when using AI systems. Right? We want people to decide for themselves.
Let me just add to that, because I think this is a really critical point. We do discuss this in the white paper, and it's absolutely essential. That like, there's a reason we're having this conversation. Like, this is civil society right now. We're in a bar. We're freely associating ideas. Yeah, well, I mean, we're civil in that sense, right? But it's also civil society in the sense of free associations between people, where you can listen and make of your own choosing what I'm saying to you, and vice versa. And so we do think that the law and existing standards are critical as constraints on what is impermissible for a system to do. But that's not the same thing as deciding what the system should do, what actions it should take. That's something, in response to the previous question, communities should have more direct active involvement in what these systems do to them and for them, right? And that's a separate question than what is impermissible for these systems to do. Those should not be conflated. And unfortunately, much of the AI ethics landscape right now does conflate those two things. And what our vision is to distinguish them such that it's actually possible to make these systems ethical and not merely compliant with prior standards that frankly were formed decades before any systems like this were even imaginable.
Yeah, and what you're just speaking to seems like it's almost a social norm component of a society where you have the laws and the social norms. And I'm curious if you have thought about any inalienable values that you want to build into your platform.
That's a great question. I mean, I can just briefly speak to that. It's a major open question right now in how, as AI is advancing its capabilities much more quickly than our ability to write standards or protocols for necessarily what it should do. There are companies right now that are experimenting with how you would put in, I don't know if they use the term inalienable rights, but there is a recent work by a company called Anthropic, which is basically what they're doing there is building what they call a constitutional approach to AI, where, and you can look at the paper and see how they explain it, but basically what they're saying is, ideally, it's kind of like, if you guys are familiar with Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, there's a spirit of that to what they're doing, where what the inalienability of the rights should be is the system should be as helpful as possible while causing as little harm as possible. So those are sort of the 2 principles. It says helpfulness and harmlessness. Now that doesn't avoid various trade-offs between those values, and that's maybe where I would step in and say, I think part of what my interest is in what daios is trying to do is think about when these trade-offs, I think, necessarily arise, right? when it's necessary for the system to make a decision or a decisive action, when I ask it a question, it could be fraught and there could be different ways of answering, that however it does that conforms to the ethical criteria of those people who are going to be most impacted by it and who are asking the question. So again, that feeds into, it's not for us to say necessarily what the rights that are inalienable should be, because that would be a technocracy. Okay? So if you don't want a technocracy, then the source of those rights would ideally come from, some notion of popular sovereignty, which would be the people, the demos, from whom those values are able to be articulated. So that's an open question, because there could be more than one group like that. But what we're trying to do is articulate that question as something that needs to be taken seriously.
See you later.
Good.
Yeah, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I have two quick questions. First of all, this is super exciting. I'm coming more from like the applied side. So I saw your pilot program on the website. I was just curious, what are you building? If you can share, or, what are the next steps?
Yeah. So next step is signing up with an AI company to run a pilot program. So we're talking with partnering up with a bunch of companies with the. Let me reframe this. So we think that solving these AI ethics problems is not only a good PR stunt, or we're not only saving the world from dystopia or from what they don't be hard, but also when you solve AI ethics problems for an AI product, you also provide a lot of user value. So when we are discussing, we haven't signed up for anything, we're discussing a pilot program with one particular company. Our KPI for a successfully run pilot was increase user retention by 30% or whatever, right? Very number was. So what we're building is a platform where the AI system can talk to our setup and inform whatever output are being presented to the users. And this in turn is ethical in a way that the users want, and also provide a lot of user value, because people want to be their agents themselves. They don't want to remove their own agency in favor of some kind of AI company. So we're building a platform. I can talk to you about the details, kind of tech stack we have after.
That's super cool.
Yeah.
I can give you a couple of things, for example, that we've run with one of our potential pilots, which was we can talk about how the training data influences the output of the algorithm. So if you wonder, why is it that an algorithm recommended something to me, you can say, well, it's been trained in this way on this kind of data, and then users are like, oh, okay, now I understand why the machine told me, this, right? Another thing would be revealing any kind of bias or slant within data sets as well. So if you recommend, for example, an article that's very pro-feminist, that would be just revealed right away. It would be there'd be a tag that would say this is kind of information, or anti-feminist too. There's a whole range of values that you can actually reveal in the data itself. And then ultimately we want to give people a way to give feedback as well. So there'd be you could click on a button and then say, okay, this output was harmful to me in this particular way, and then that would be given back to the developers so that you could actually start integrating in some of that feedback. And that's where where one of our experimental aspects would come into play. So we actually think that you can train AI human values through curated data sets, and we'd actually do that within that whole training loop. So that's kind of how a potential pilot might look, just to give you more details.
Super sick.
Yeah.
Oh, so I think you had mentioned that the determination of ethics should be determined from a user perspective.
Yep.
And another example, thinking of real life examples, are the prediction of recidivism in parole hearings.
Okay.
And there have been widely used machine learning AI systems there, and they've been heavily criticized.
Yeah.
From a societal perspective, maybe a model that's biased against the convict is positive for society. It's negative for the convict. So there could be three users. It's the prisoner themselves, it's the criminal justice system, and it's society who wants to be protected from the recidivism rate.
Right.
So when you've got multiple users with conflicting determination of,
Right.
of the ethical value of the system, how do you reconcile that? I mean, how do you determine, you know, from whose prism are you using to determine ethical?
Yeah, I have a take on this, but you think to have, yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so, excellent question. Short answer, I don't know. The thing is, the long answer is that we ourselves as daios, we don't want to be the ones that are the users deciding what's right or what's wrong. We're not the users. That's the thing, right? So that's our whole reason for existing, is that we don't want to be the ones deciding that, like, oh, it's better to like keep this guy in jail for a couple more years or not, right? We're not the users here. So this is a very murky situation, so I'm not sure who will be the users. What I can tell you is that it wouldn't be us. Right? Because as soon as we try to smuggle in our own evidence, we destroy trust with these people. We don't need that. Right? I have no idea. I don't know.
Yeah, that was also.
Yeah.
I was gonna actually I'm very familiar with Compass. I'm very familiar with the use case that you're referring to here. But something about the way you phrased it reminded me of maybe this is a bit of a spoiler, but it's been over 10 years since this movie came out. But at the end of The Dark Knight, you guys might remember this famous scene where you got these two boats. One is full of felons, the other is full of like ordinary citizens or something like that. And there's this contrived situation where the Joker is sort of making each of them gives them a detonator and says you have to before midnight or whatever, you have to choose, like, if you destroy the other boat, then I'll spare your boat, something like this, right? And there's a moment where on the civilian boat, there's a man there who says, like, well, the people on the other boat, they made their choices, okay? So, like, they shouldn't have a right to basically, like, it doesn't make any sense to let them live while we, who haven't committed these felonies, should die. And so he, like, takes the detonator, and this is sort of the climax of the movie is this very anxiety-inducing moment where it's like, are you actually going to take the law into your own hands in that moment, right? So I think it rests on this notion of who has the right to determine societal rules. And what's missing in that moment, of course, is, I guess my answer to the question is, what's missing in that moment is an independent judiciary, okay? So we have separation of powers in this country, where it's not algorithms that decide, at least who shouldn't get to decide who gets policed. It would be the courts, you know, a vast judicial apparatus that's responsible for it, whether it's a jury, whether it's a judge, whether it's, you know, we have a vast machinery in place already, where predictive algorithms for recidivism and, you know, predicting who's most likely to recommit crimes, those are interesting tools that entity could reference in its deliberation, but it can't replace that deliberation. You can't actually automate that choice. And that's actually really our point, is that it should be in the hands of those who are already the people who should be the ones making those choices. They are the ones who should be appealed to for these kinds of considerations.
So Compass understands the models, they're selling the model, the people on the other side who are receiving the model don't understand statistical flaws in the model and aren't able to be in. They might just say, well, it's a statistic. The magic of statistics might overwhelm their otherwise judgment call in how they use the model.
Right. So I think that's wrong.
Right,
Yes,
yeah.
because it's it's kind of a fraught case, but it's illustrative of the fact that you cannot automate or outsource fundamental organizational questions about who has certain rights of due process or of, you know, any other, you know, judiciary considerations. And so there's a very complicated relationship between, in that case, governance and what these systems may or may not be able to anticipate or predict that needs to be determined, but that determination should remain in the hands of the people, broadly construed. And figuring out where that aligns with the machinery of government is a complicated question, but very much what we're proposing fits into that question.
That's for the question.
So much. Appreciate you guys.
Yeah.
Have a good evening. I hope your ethics in AI is.
Yeah.
Thank
I
you.
hope
Thanks.
it fucking works.
Thank you for your support. Yeah.
So I think a lot of people, when they hear about like ethical AI, jump to thinking about like whether you can code an answer to the trolley problem or whatever. But like as the people who create AI, I think an emerging problem is like the misuse of AI. Do you think that that's something that like should be or like can be like developed against or like or compensated for in any way? Like is that?
Oh, you have an answer for this one?
I may do.
Okay, Solveig wants to take a go.
So I had an interesting conversation with someone who was far more of an expert in AI than I was. And this was a point that came up, which was that essentially we're at this kind of pain point where there's a lot of growing pains, especially with things like ChatGPT, OpenAI, things that literally anyone can use and take. And there's a difference between like making a model in a vacuum and applying it to a specific thing for which it was designed, and then taking that technology and applying it for your own purpose without understanding how it was designed or how that model may misbehave in a context that it was not designed for. And so I think that I don't have a solution for that. I think that we're at a point where the public itself, as people who are learning to interact with the models, that's something that needs to be learned as an individual and as a society. Like the difference between I can do something, so I should, and the difference between I can do something, what might that do, right? Do you have anything you want to say?
Yeah, I'll just briefly respond to the trolley problem question because I get this a lot. I kind of already mentioned it, I think, in my reference to you should have the ability to say what you want this system to do for you, not just what you don't want it to do. So there's a difference between asking who shouldn't die through the use of a system, or who should die, because ideally you'd want the car to kill nobody. Or at least I wouldn't want the car to kill anybody. The positive phrasing of that question is, how do you want roads to work? Right? Self-driving cars, this is my main case study for my PhD work. Self-driving cars will change roads. They will change the flow of traffic. You can already look at videos on YouTube of the streets of San Francisco becoming unusable because fleets of these vehicles, they herd and they shove other drivers off the road and make it impossible to use lanes. That's the operative question in that case, is who owns roads? Who gets to use them? How will the operation of a qualitatively new system change what roads can be? And as Andrew was saying, AI is very positive. AI provides an enormous increase in capability to what roads could be, or what cities could be, how fast you get to work on time, and all other considerations that you can optimize traffic with a system like that. So it's very tragic to me that the most influential framing of the ethics of AI is about, tell me how many fewer people my system can kill before we make it to market, rather than how is it that I, the builder of this system, am responsible for preserving or even enacting what you want of this infrastructure, namely like public infrastructure of roads. And just think about, that's a major shift in mindset. So those are the questions that are operative to me when we think about language models, when we think about credit scoring, when we think about recidivism. How do you want the judicial system to work? How do you want the courts to work? How do you want roads to work? Not how do I automate my own agency to a system so that it does the least damage to me?
Clearly, like, I understand why you as an organization can't take like a principled stand on anything ethically, because then you would be assaulted and cease to be useful, right? Like, so I understand that, and the need to sort of like sort of allow the institutions which do these sorts of things, provide them the tools to do this more effectively, and also, and I think sort of there's this capitalist assumption that it's basically if the user has a good experience, it's good for the company. So therefore, put the user in control of the feedback loop, and in many cases, this will improve the product, right? So I like both of those impulses. They seem like sustainable, right? I'm wondering, and because I haven't been reading up too much on this space, I'm wondering if, knowing that we're going into a future where these kinds of models will be adjudicated, right? Like they will be, where people will be on trial, right? Constantly, right? Like somebody will say, hey, this is infringing upon my rights that are constitutional or in some other framework, right? So therefore it needs to be remediated, and this is regulatory, right? If there's any work in progress about models being able to describe their own influence, and I don't want to say biases, because to a model it's an influence, right? It's like, what are the things that you tend to do most often? Like, what are the things you were trained to do? What was your loss function, right? Like what is the thing that whose objective are you optimizing, right? And like I'm wondering if there's any work in that space that would just sort of make it easier for a model to just sort of actually take a stand and basically be like, this is what I do, you tell me whether it's okay.
Yeah, we can take that. So there's tons of research into how to basically show provenance of certain decisions that make. Yeah, you can the layman's right now is just Google explainable AI, and there is a bunch of research into the given a particular neural network, when a neural network made a particular prediction, what was the influence on this prediction. There's tons of work, and it's very useful when you're dealing with legal issues, right? But quite often, making AI be able to explain its own decision, it's suboptimal from the perspective of making AI most accurate, most efficient. So there's always this thing, there's always this tension, right? Because you can sometimes make a model much better, but you lose its ability to explain itself, right? So yes, but there's tons of work. People are interested in that for exactly the reason that you mentioned, like for legal reasons. Yeah. But even I know there are some branches of an industry which sacrifice accuracy for experimentation. Yeah. How does that answer the question?
Any questions? Cool. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thanks for
We really
supporting
appreciate it. Be sure to take a pamphlet. It's got a QR code to the white paper if you're interested in reading the whole thing. It's also got all of our contact information on there in case you have any further questions.